In today's tutorial, we will utilize Firebase Real-Time Remote Config to dynamically hide or show a button. The advantage of using Firebase in this manner is that our app doesn't need to be recompiled or submitted to the App Store. All updates can be implemented remotely through Firebase. For example, to hide the button within Firebase, we just scroll down to our config. At the moment, it's set to true for the button to be shown. But if we edit this to false and then click on save, then click publish changes, now the button will be invisible on the simulator. It's not seen on the simulator anymore. Because before we'd have to resubmit the source code to the App Store or recompile our app to do things like this. And then if we want to display our button again, we just navigate or scroll down to our config and then select true to show the button. Click on save, click on publish. And then within SwiftUI, our changes are reflected in about 5 seconds. There's the button. This is what we're creating in this tutorial. The first thing we need to do is to configure Firebase. I'll just open up a new tab. And then you have to navigate to console.firebase.google.com. Add a new project by clicking on the plus sign. Create your project name. I'll just call it Firebase Web Config Tester. Click on continue. Continue again. I'll just use the default account for Firebase. Click on create. Just creating the Firebase at the moment. Click on continue. And then, because we're creating an iOS Swift or SwiftUI application, we have to click on the iOS button here to add Firebase to our iOS application. And then we need to copy our app bundle ID, which is within the project. So you should have an empty SwiftUI project. And then just copy your bundle identifier from your project. Which is on General tab. So select your project name and then click on General or go to Sign In. You can do it that way as well. And then just copy your bundle identifier and that needs to be applied to your bundle ID within Firebase. So just paste it there. The app nickname, that can be optional, so you can leave it blank if you want to. The next thing we need to do is click on the register app button. And then we need to download Google services -info.plist. And then navigate to the downloaded file that we just downloaded, the Google services.plist, in the downloads folder. That plist we need to drag into our Firebase project, which is our SwiftUI project. Just drag it and drop it. And make sure copy items if needed is ticked. And then just click on finish button. Now we need to navigate to Firebase. And then follow the remaining instructions are there. Click on next. Then click on next again. You can just skip all of this. Click on continue to console. And now we have to create our CocoaPods file. To create the actual pods to assign to our pod file, we first need to create our pod file. To do that, we need to open up terminal. And then type in cd. And select the blue icon at the top, your project name, and then drag it onto the terminal and delete everything between Firebase real-time remote config .xcode project. So just delete everything up to there. Click on enter. To create our empty pod file, we need to type in pod init, which means initialize the pod file. And now it's created our empty pod file, as you can see here. Or I can show it to you on the desktop within the folder, which is here. This is the pod file. So we need to add our Firebase pods to the pod file. There's many ways you can do this. I think one of the easiest ways is to just hold down the control key and then left click on your mouse, click on open with, and then we can edit it with text edit. And then we just apply our pod files. So we just type in pod. Firebase. All. pod, Firebase, Firestore, pod, that should be lowercase p, Firebase, Firestore, Swift, pod, Firebase Remote Config. Click on save. And now we need to install our pod files or assign our pod files to our project. So to do that, let's exit Xcode. And then to assign our pod file to our project, to type in pod install. And now it will attempt to install all of your pod dependencies. Still installing at the moment. It's just taking a bit of time. It's installed now. So now the next thing we need to do is open our Xcode workspace project that should have been created after we executed those commands. So this is the one you need to open. The white one here, the one that I'm highlighting. And then the next thing we need to do is open our Firebase Real-Time Remote Config app, the main file, which includes the window group, so this file here. And then just to make sure that the pod files were installed correctly, just type in import Firebase. It should pick up the Firebase import. And just to make sure, I'll try to run it to see if it's runnable or if it crashes. If it crashes, that means CocoaPods didn't work correctly or it's not configured correctly to the project. It's just building at the moment. It's still building. As you can see, the application has now compiled, so Firebase and the pods have been assigned to the application correctly. In next week's tutorial, we'll implement the class that we'll call Firebase Web Config. Thank you for joining us. If you found this tutorial helpful, please comment, like and subscribe. See you next week. In today's tutorial, we will implement the config within Firebase and create our Firebase Remote Config settings class that will include a function and a listener to detect when the config has been changed remotely within Firebase. Within your project, create a new file. Select Swift file. Name the file Firebase Remote Config Settings. So this is the name of the class. And then the next thing we need to do is to import Firebase Remote Config. We're importing Firebase Remote Config from the pod files that we downloaded last week. The next thing we need to do is to create an enum, and the purpose of the enum is to represent the keys that are stored in Firebase Remote Config. So the keys that we'll be using, or that we're going to create later, is it's called show button. So hide and show button will be assigned to our key, which is in Firebase, that we're creating in a few minutes. That's called show button. So this is the key that we will create in Firebase, show button. So now let's head over to Firebase. And we're using the same URL that we used last week. It's console.firebase.google.com. And then select the Firebase Web Config Tester that we created last week. Click on it. To create our config, we need to select Engage, which is this one, and then click on Remote Config. And then click on Create Configuration. And then within the parameter name, which is the key, we assign our key, which is called show button. And then the data type for show button will be Boolean, as in true and false, true to show the button or false to hide the button. And then next thing we need to do is select a default value, show the button, and just set it to true. And then click on save. And then to publish the changes, we need to click on the publish change button. And then the actual config is displayed down below, which is here. So if we wanted to edit the config, just click on the pencil icon and click on edit. And then we can change it to false if we wanted to. So that's the config done. So now we have to return back to Xcode. Oh yeah, we need to publish the changes. Return back to Xcode, and then within our Firebase Remote Config settings class, we need to define our actual class by using the following declaration: public class Firebase. I'll just copy it from here. Firebase Remote Config settings. And the next thing we need to do is to create an instance of the remote config settings. Type in let settings equals remote config settings. And then we need to create an initializer. Settings.minimum fetch interval equals 0. And the purpose of that is to set the minimum fetch interval to 0. Is to always fetch the latest values on every app launch. Remote config config settings equals settings. And then now we create our first function, which is called fetch Firebase Remote Config hide and show button. So this function will return a closure. Show button at escaping all void. So the completion handler will be returning back a true or false data type to hide or show the button. Next thing we need to do is to define the default values for Firebase Remote Config. And its object. Firebase config dot hide or show button dot raw value is true as NS object. So line 26, and it should be defaults, an S at the end. True. That should be as NS object. Let's see if that's right. Yeah, I think that's correct now. So lines 26, what that does, it creates a dictionary that has a key called show button, which is here, and the key will have a default value of true within the dictionary. And now we need to set the defaults and assign it to remote config. Set defaults. Pass in our defaults. The next thing we need to do is to fetch the remote config values from our closure. Remote config, fetch, status, in. So we need to check that the fetch was successful from Firebase Remote. If status is successful, then do the following. If it's successful, then we need to activate the remote config values. Remote config, activate, let remote config equals remote config dot remote config. Let key equals Firebase config dot hide or show button dot raw value. So to return the raw value, we need to return it on the main thread, which is the GUI thread. Dispatch queue no, that's incorrect. We need to check to make sure that the key exists in the remote config first. If remote config value for key which is this key here, dot source is not equal to static, then what's happened there? Static. Oh, I missed out a dot. It should be dot, full stop, static. So if it's not static, then we need to attempt to get the actual Boolean value from the remote config. Let hide equals remote config value for key boom value Boolean value. On line 40, remote was spelled incorrectly. Remote config next thing we need to do is call dispatch queue main async. and then we want to return whether to show the button or not within our closure by returning the Boolean value that is called hide. So if hide includes false, that means the button should be visible. Or if hide is true, the button should be invisible. So really, the name hide, it should have a better verbal name, but maybe we can fix that later. On lines 49, if any of the keys do not exist, we need to use an else statement. Let hide defaults, open bracket, Firebase config dot hide or show button dot raw value as bool and then we need to use the dispatch queue main async block again. And then the next thing we need to do, if the fetch failed for any reason, then within this else statement, we need to use our defaults. So we can just copy what we've done previously. Really, this would have been better using a sync and a wait, as it reduces the code for the closures, the completion handlers and everything. I'll just compile it. I think there's a bracket missing. So after lines 55, I think we need another bracket here. I'll just compile it again. And delete the bracket at the end. See if that works. Just compiling at the moment. It's compiled, so that's good. In next week's tutorial, we will implement the fetch Firebase Remote Config hide and show listener button function that will enable the application to detect whenever any value has been changed within Firebase Remote Config, as it will be listening in real time. And then we'll also start to implement the GUI functionality so you can see how everything works using SwiftUI. Thank you for joining us. If you found this tutorial helpful, please comment, like and subscribe. See you next week. The functionality we are creating today is the Firebase Listener function. The purpose of the Firebase Listener function is to listen for any changes detected on Firebase and apply those changes to the iOS application to hide or show the button. We will now add the new functionality. So type in the following: func fetch Firebase Remote Config hide and show listener button. This function will now accept a closure called show button at escaping bool. Next thing we need to do is to add an update listener for the Firebase Remote Config. Remote config dot remote config add config update listener. And that's the completion handler we need to use. Config update error in. The next thing we need to do is to check to see if the config update is nil by using the guard statement. The update should be a capital U. Error equals nil, else. So what this does, if there's an error or the config update is nil, then we will use our defaults, which is false, to show the actual button on the screen, and then we return out of the guard statement. After line 76, the next thing we need to do is to check if the updated keys includes the actual keys for hiding or showing the button. If config update keys contains Firebase config hide or show button raw value. So the raw value is this value here. So if this key exists in Firebase that we created, I think it was the last tutorial, the previous tutorial, then we need to get the latest value of that key. So we type in let remote, and the latest value of the key will either be true or false. Let remote config equals remote config. So that value will be either to show or hide a button on the view. Let config value equals remote config value for key, which is Firebase config hide or show button raw value. Let hide button value equals exclamation mark config value bool value. The purpose of that is to invert the boolean value, for example, flip the boolean value. The next thing we need to do is to activate the updated configuration. So we type in remote config.remote that should be a capital R for remote config. Remote config should be capital R. Remote config activate changed error in. Let's open our closure. That shouldn't be active, that should be activate on lines 84. Next thing we need to do is to check to make sure the error that there's no error. So if there was an error within show button, that will be false. But if there wasn't any error, then we just return whatever value we receive from Firebase Remote Config. So this value will be to hide or show the button on the view. But that should be dispatch queue main async. Just compile it. Another thing we need to do is within the Firebase app file, which is this one here, within our main app file or main project file, which is Firebase Real-Time Remote Config app. Also need to initialize Firebase. So we do that after line 13. Just create an initializer. And then we just type in Firebase app configure. So what that does, it gets Firebase ready to perform all the operations that we want it to perform, including methods and other attributes that we need to use within the application. I'll just compile it. In next week's lesson, we will start to implement the content view so that Firebase can interact with the view to hide and show the button based on the config value of true and false that will be retrieved from Firebase. Thank you for joining us. If you found this tutorial helpful, please comment, like and subscribe. See you next week. In today's tutorial, We will implement the content view to enable the button to be hidden or shown using Firebase Config. So this is what we'll be doing. So within Firebase Config, so if I assign the button to true, like by clicking on the pencil, click on save. So at the moment you can see there's no button there at the moment, but when I click on publish changes, the synchronization will happen from Firebase to the iOS application, and then the button will be displayed on the simulator, as you can see here. And then if you want to hide the button, you just do a similar thing. Click on the pencil, the edit button. Select false to hide the button. Show button is false. Click on save. And then click on publish changes. And then the button will be hidden in about 3 seconds. As you can see, it's now hidden. So this is the functionality we'll be adding to the content view to enable the content view to call the Firebase class that we created in the previous tutorials. Within your content view, add the following: @state private bar Firebase Remote Config equals Firebase Remote Config settings. So we just need to create an instance of that to use the functions within the class. @state private bar show button. So initially, show button will be assigned to true, that the button should be shown, but you can always change this to false if you want to. Within the vstat, delete the following lines between 18 and 21. Also delete the padding. If show button show button is true, then it will attempt to show the button. So the button is created externally within a struct, just to have some code separation. Struct my button view bar action and our closure void. And the purpose of that closure is to represent the action to perform when the button is tapped. Bar title string which will be the title of the button. For example, I think we're initially using something like 3 products on the bottom as the caption. Yeah, this is what we're using. Get your free item. That's the name of the caption for the button. And then when typing button action, so we're using the closure here in the button here. text title, got padding, got foreground color, got white, got background color, got green, dot corner, radius 10, dot padding, dot horizontal 20, dot padding, dot vertical 10, dot button style, dot plain, and we need a closing bracket there. Oh, we missed out something, bar, body, some view, and now I'll just indent it, and on line 38 we need a semicolon, oh that should just be dot plain. On line 49, no open bracket, close brackets, just dot plain. Compile it again. Compiled. Now we return to our if statement block. My button that we just created. Got this wrong. So it should be my button, open bracket action. And then the text of the button will be get your free item. Got padding. Dot on a pair. And the purpose of using dot on a pair is to fetch Firebase Remote Config to determine whether to show the button or not. So we do the fetch using our instance that we created earlier. Fetch Firebase Remote Config is the first one. Hide and show button. Then within the closure, we just create the show button. Self. dot show button is equal to show button. So this show button, this is the value that's coming from Firebase Web Config via the Firebase Remote Config settings class that we created previously. So if the Firebase Web Config, if it had true, that means the button will be shown on the screen, but if it contains false, the button will be hidden. And that's done by using this if statement. And now we need to use the listener. And the listener just listens for any changes that's happened within Firebase. Show button in. So each time we click between true and false within Firebase, the application will react at the same time and either show or hide the button. Just compile it. It's compiled. Now let's run the application to see if it's working or not. So as you can see, the Firebase Web Config is working, the button is not shown. So to make the button visible, you need to navigate to Firebase Remote Config. And then, like I'll show you now, so you click on, once you're here, console.firebase.google.com. So click within your Firebase Remote Config project. I just called it Firebase Web Config Tester in the first tutorial that we've done. And then click on Engage. Then click on Remote Config. And as you can see, the Firebase Remote Config is set to false to hide the button. So to make the button visible, we need to assign it to true. Click on Save. And then click on Publish Changes. Now the button should be visible on the screen, as you can see. Here it is. Within the simulator. And then to make it invisible, we just do the same thing. Click on the pencil, the edit button, which is here. Click on False. False to show the button. Publish changes. Publish changes again. And as you can see, the button is invisible. And that's done by using the listener, because the Firebase listener is listening for all the events that's happening, and then it's sending the actual requests to the app, to the iOS app on the simulator. And then within the simulator, it's just deciding what to do with the Boolean value, as in to show or hide the button. Thank you for joining us. If you found this tutorial helpful, please comment, like and subscribe. See you next week. Thank you for joining us. If you found this tutorial helpful, please comment, like and subscribe. See you next week.